Hi, my name is Chris Maxey. I'm the CEO of Prefix Accounting. Today, we're going to be covering 2023 predictions for the restaurant industry. If you're not familiar with Prefix Accounting, we are a bookkeeping, payroll, and advisory firm that specializes in the restaurant industry. We have a focus on independent restaurants, usually more upscale and focusing more on local sourcing. We do everything from soup to nuts, full accrual bookkeeping, full payroll reconciliations and payroll processing, as well as advisory and KPI and financial analysis. As a note, we have this at the beginning of all of our presentations. This is not legal or tax advice. Anything that you see here is prepared for informational purposes only. It is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for tax, legal, or accounting advice. We are doing these webinars on a bi-monthly basis. So if you are interested in any of the other topics that we have covered, feel free to look on our website and register for any of the other webinars that we have listed. They're all free, and they're all focusing on the restaurant industry. This webinar, if you are registered for it, will be recorded and then uploaded to YouTube later in the week, and you're free to view it there. If you'd like to see any more of these webinars, you can also sign up for our newsletter on our website. If you log on to our website at prefix.accountants, wait a few seconds and you'll see a pop-up notification where you can sign up for our newsletter. It's not a very salesy newsletter. We only send out emails when they're relevant and also look to make sure that the content is fresh and is useful and not just a monthly newsletter that tells you nothing. Looking at today's overview, we are going to be looking at a couple of topics that are important for 2023. The first of which has been the topic that has been beaten to death in 2022, which is inflation. Next, we're going to be looking at the interest rate and what the hell the Fed is and why it is relevant to the restaurant industry. Next, we will take a look at the very hot button topic currently of a potential looming recession and how that affects the restaurant industry, and why that still, regardless of a recession, 2023 might be a better year than 2022. Finally, we are going to be looking at what we look at for predictive data, and we're constantly pulling details to look forward and make some assumptions based off of what the short-term and long-term forecast looks like for the restaurant industry. First things first, we'll take a look at the interest rates. And so one of the things that you constantly hear about is the Fed and the federal and what it has to do with the interest rates rising. The Fed is short for the Federal Reserve. It's an agency that sets monetary policy, controls the interest rates and money supply. It is kind of a secret, weirdly secretive agency. They don't say much because so many people rely on what they say and try to analyze what they say and interpret it into what might be coming down the pipe. So because of that, they don't say much because people will take a small statement that they have, an excerpt of a sentence that they have, and then infer all of this information from it. So because of that, they don't really say much because people panic quickly if they do say anything even remotely dramatic. They'll maybe have a couple of sentences in a statement, and people will start making all sorts of crazy predictions on it. You can Google at any point, Federal Reserve rate, and you'll have 35 articles pop up in the last day about something that was said a month ago and what their opinion on what they said is. So regardless of that, how is that important to the restaurant industry? Well, the Federal Reserve sets the interest rate for the economy. It's the base interest rate that everybody utilizes in the United States. They use the interest rate to basically slow down the economy. It is a tool for putting the brakes on when the economy is overheating. And so when you have high inflation or you have a bubbly market, that people's expectations are way outside of reality, the Federal Reserve increases the interest rate to slow it down. So how that works is essentially they increase the interest rate and suddenly people are thinking more about whether or not they want to make that purchase, whether they want to buy that car, because they could have gotten that car at 0% APR a couple of years ago, but with inflation rising now, you can't buy a car for that amount because interest rates are increasing. So people start to not buy as much as they used to, and that slows that lack of consumption and purchasing slows down the economy, and it slows down inflation. So that is what they're currently doing. Looking back at last year, inflation was like 6% for the entire year, particularly in the Northeast. Um, the um, the that number is starting to decline. But the Federal Reserve is talking about that interest rate going up to 5%. It's at about 4.5% right now. So it's not looking to go up much further, though you can find articles where people say it'll be 6% or 8%, but the consensus is that it's probably going to be about 5%. Inflation's already starting to slow down, so they're not looking to increase the interest rate much further than what it is. What we can expect is that the amount the rate or the time period in which the rate has increased, they will eventually decrease that interest rate, and the amount of time that it takes for them to increase the rate takes double for what they decrease the rate. So if you look at where we are right now, the beginning of the year of 2022, they started increasing interest rates through the end of the year. So about nine months. It is probably going to take them about 18 months for them to get that interest rate back down to zero, but it may not get all the way back down to zero. They may keep it at 0.5% or something along those lines. And we can expect that they're probably going to start cutting the rate in the next quarter or so. Inflation is the next big topic, and one of the things that we're looking back at 2022, the inflation for the year was about 6.5% overall, which is the highest it's been for a long time. And normally inflation in the United States is anywhere between 1.5% and 2%. It's 3 to 4 times that amount. But as you can see here with this graph, you can see that inflation is already starting to decline, which means that the Federal Reserve's interest rate hikes have had the intended effect that they were supposed to. It's a lagging indicator, so they increase the interest rates, and then it takes a couple of months for that to work out and for you to see results on that. That's why it takes a lot longer for them to decrease the rates. The food index, which is looking at specifically a smaller segment of goods, rose 11.4%. So double what the general inflation rate was. So we're looking at the food costs increasing by 6 to 8 times what the normal inflation rate was. And we experienced that, and that is one of the things that was most difficult about COVID, was that you constantly had to change menu pricing because prices were unstable, and chicken wings were one issue, and then brisket was another, where you constantly had to deal with one thing or another increasing in rate with no seeming logic at all. Looking forward at 2023, we're expecting those interest rates or those inflation rates to slow, but still be quite high. So the USDA will put out a perspective each year where they will create an analysis on what the coming year's interest rates are going to be. And this is a very large document, but they have a lot of really good information here as to like what things they're expecting to increase, what things they're expecting to decrease. And it's really useful for us as restaurateurs because we can look and see what things they're really expecting to increase, and kind of plan around that a little bit. Now, this is a forecast, so there's a range here, and you have to take it with a grain of salt. But if you're seeing massive increases like fats and oils, for example, that's a consideration that you should see, that like 16.5% for fats and oils is a huge number. So when you're planning your seasonal menus and you're planning your summer menus, it helps when you're planning that menu to look at what is coming and kind of plan around that. To some degree, you're not going to be able to completely eliminate those food groups, obviously. Fats and oils are included in everything. But, if you're currently doing a lot of like fried foods and things like that, fryer oil is going to be expensive. So maybe point the menu away from having a ton of fried food so you're changing your fryer oil less. We're also seeing they're also predicting a decrease in protein prices, which is something that has been was a little bit surprising to me, since protein prices were the things that were really out of whack last year. So they're expecting that those prices to normalize and become more stable. It's really fruits, grains, fats, and oils that are going to be the biggest increase and the most unpredictable. The reason why that is because or one of the factors is because the Ukraine is actually, I believe, either the first or second largest producer of fertilizer in the world. And so because of that, there is a shortage on fertilizers. And so we're seeing that supply chain interruption where that is causing an increase in fruits and grains and vegetables. A lot of produce related costs. We will probably see in the coming year that is going to translate to protein costs, because proteins, generally speaking, are consuming grains and things like that. So it'll be a little bit of a lagging indicator there. Looking at 22 versus 2019, one of the things that we use for some predictive data is OpenTable. OpenTable, for those people not familiar with it, is the predecessor to Resi. It is a reservation system, and we like to utilize this a lot because it controls for inflation. What they're looking at here is, or what they're making public here, is their reservation data, which is super helpful because it controls for price point and also inflation. They're just looking at how many people made a reservation, not what they paid for reservations, not anything else. It's just how many people sat down versus last year. So inflation isn't a factor, price isn't a factor. It's just looking at the basic information. So they make all of their reservation data public, which is fantastic. They did it during COVID when it first started. It was wild to look at this. But what they have here is they compare each year. So 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022. For restaurants, the most relevant data is 2019 versus 2022. 2020 and 2021, we're not going to be comparing numbers ever, really, because they're just such an outlier. But 2019 versus 2022 is. And as you can see here, that's that solid line that we have there. So You can view this data by state, by major city, and by country even. So Massachusetts, you can see here over the last couple of weeks, they do every single day in this data set. It's fantastic data. But you can see that they have a pretty large variance from last year or from 2019. That's a pretty big departure, 20%. I live in Vermont, and you can also not see Vermont because it's too small. So Massachusetts is really the best comparison that I have here. So you can see the last couple of weeks have been particularly difficult, especially around last weekend. Last weekend here was 20 degrees below zero, so you can expect that most people did not want to leave their house. So the weekend was quite rough. But ski season has been terrible here because it's either been frigid or hot or somewhere in between changing very quickly. There's no snow. So there's no tourism right now. So the other thing that people are currently talking about right now is whether or not this year is going to have a recession. And it is likely that there will be a recession. It is probably not going to be a recession that is comparable to 2008 housing crisis, but given all the inflation, given the interest rate increases, you're starting to see a lot of contractions in certain markets. For example, right now you're seeing all over the place tech layoffs and e-commerce layoffs. There's a big difference for restaurants as to what the current how that affects restaurants or a recession affects restaurants. Traditionally speaking, and we're looking back to like 1990s, 1980s, things like that. Restaurants were definitely considered highly elastic goods, and elastic goods is an economics term for is highly correlated to something. So in this case, if the economy goes down, something that is highly elastic is highly correlated to another indicator. So restaurants or the economy tanks, maybe decreases by 4%, which is a large amount. And restaurants will also see a reduction in revenue to the tune of 4% or greater. And back in the day, restaurants were so highly correlated and so highly elastic to the economy that if the economy contracted 4%, restaurants probably contracted 20%. And the reason that is because generationally speaking, consumers used to look at dining out as a luxury and the easiest thing to cut out of their spending. Generally speaking, boomers and baby boomers would generally speaking go out once per week, so they would cut that once per week out of their weekly spend, and they would eat at home. So it was a recession was hugely devastating to restaurants. They'll also decrease their consumer spending overall, and then they have increased consumer price sensitivity. So if you had a period of inflation paired with a recession, that made it even worse for restaurants. So that's why it was so highly elastic. And historically, restaurants have never gotten any aid. The reason being because there really is not a strong lobby for the restaurant industry. The only notable lobby that the restaurant industry has is the NRA, which focuses primarily on franchises like McDonald's, Taco Bell, things like that. They don't really care necessarily about mom and pop or independent restaurants. They say they do, but let's be real here. looking at how recessions affect the modern economy, there is a lot of changes that have happened since the 1980s. There are new generations that have purchasing power, and those younger generations have very different habits than baby boomers. The first of which is millennials eat out 3 times per week, either at a sit-down restaurant or order carry-out. That is very different from boomers who would eat out weekly. And also we have Gen Z starting to have disposable income, and they also order takeout 1 to 2 times per week, mostly focused on takeout and less about eating out at a sit-down restaurant. So Gen Z is just starting to become part of the economy. They are growing. They have growing purchasing power with every passing year that they join the workforce, and so it's likely that they're going to start to consume more at restaurants than they currently do, where their purchasing power is slightly less because a lot of them are just joining the workforce, or they are just they're getting out of college. But they are definitely consuming more than baby boomers. The other consideration here is that, what I should say about that inference there is that millennials and Gen Z are much more dependent on the restaurant industry as part of their weekly staple than baby boomers are. It is not looked at as a luxury good, it is looked at as a base good. So with the economy contracting, it's likely that millennials and Gen Z will probably eat less, but we're talking about eating twice per week versus 3 times per week, which is a big difference from eating out once per week to 0 times per week. So essentially, restaurants are still an elastic good, but it's much less elastic than it used to be. The next consideration here is that with a recession looming, events are still going to be strong, but they are going to be declining. In 2022, there were more weddings in 2022 than there has been since 1984, I believe. That is because all of the weddings that were supposed to happen in 2020, 2021 were pushed into 2022. That is going to continue to be the case, where a lot of those weddings are now pushed into 2023. However, that supply of weddings and events will start to normalize and go back down to the baseline that it was previous to COVID. So building out a catering business makes sense now, but probably not wise to make a huge investment into it unless you're expecting that this is going to be a large part of your business that you are going to compete heavily on in the coming years. Because what is going to happen is there will be a contraction in events revenue, and there will be the same number of suppliers that are offering catering services, but a lot less clients out there. So you're competing for a lot more for business, whereas right now you're not really competing and you have all of the power essentially. It is also worth noting that there's possibly no aid. It is a very long shot, but with COVID, one of the silver linings of COVID is that a lot of independent restaurateurs realized that the NRA was not going to represent them and went out and created their own lobbying organizations that have a lot more of a vocal base than the NRA, and are starting to make noise every time that there's an issue with independent restaurants. It is still an insanely long shot. The restaurant lobby is nowhere near as powerful as, say, the airline lobby or the banking lobby that get aid every single time the economy contracts. Looking at 2022 or 2023, one of the trends that is going to be a big factor is diversification of income. I think that we can all agree that when we looked at what 2020 showed us was that if if your sit down restaurant couldn't be a sit down restaurant, you were very vulnerable to closure. A lot of restaurants closed because of it. So looking at 2023, one of the things that is a big consideration is figuring out ways to shore up your revenue so that if there is another worldwide epidemic, you have another income source that is not dependent on sit down dining, but is can supplement the business during that closure. So retail food and beverage, looking to acquire the real estate that you're in, and then having secondary income from purchasing the building that you're in. And also looking at ghost kitchens and delivery are the big things that are out there. Retail food and beverage shops also work well because they pull from the same inventory. And so you can easily add something like that. The other consideration is delivery, which is maturing in urban markets, but is still penetrating rural markets. And with Gen Z consumers, like I was saying before, they are looking for takeout and carry out and delivery. They want something to be frictionless, and they don't want to have to talk to somebody. So looking at making sure that your point of sale or a third party takeout service works really well with your current systems, and then also is very frictionless for consumers, is a huge win for attracting that Gen Z consumer. The other consideration here is continued shifts in labor. One of the things that was in addition to increasing food costs was increasing labor costs in 2022 and 2021. Here, 2023 is going to be quite different. One thing that will continue is employee lawsuits. A lot of attorneys have become wise to the fact that it is quite easy to sue a restaurant for labor practices, errors in their labor practices. So making sure that you have a handbook and making sure that it was updated in the last decade is incredibly important. And when I say last decade, this should be updated every single year, sometimes multiple times a year. You update your handbook, you follow the policies that are in the handbook, you make sure that there is transparency, and then employee lawsuits become less of a risk. The other thing to consider is EPLI insurance, which is employee labor practices insurance, which protects you in case you make an error, so that if there is a lawsuit, it's not necessarily going to hit you directly. We will see continued increases to wages, but it's going to be at a much slower pace, especially with the negative outlook on the economy right now. If there is a recession, likely what's going to happen is that for many folks, the hospitality industry is a fallback industry during recession. So if people lose their tech jobs, they may fall back on what they were doing in high school or college and go start bartending until they find that next job. If that happens, you'll see a huge increase to labor supply, which would then decrease the wage increase. Essentially, you have more supply of labor. There is not necessarily as much demand for labor. That demand doesn't shift either. And so what happens there is the price of wages will decrease. One of the things that is becoming more of a topic as well is the unionization of the workforce. We're seeing it happen in a lot of coastal cities where places like Darwin's here in Boston tried to unionize, and what used to be something you would never see in the restaurant industry is suddenly becoming an issue, or not necessarily an issue, but something that you have to be prepared for. And you need to have a plan in the event that there is actually that your employees do unionize. Don't do what Darwin's did and just close up shop. Like, they just closed. They didn't want to deal with it. They closed, and everybody was out of a job, and they just closed up shop, threw their rattle, and went home. Not really a wise way to do it. There was a number of ways that they could have avoided the same problem. So having a plan in place for any potential union issues is important. You need to talk this through with partnership and be cognizant of the fact that it's potential, that it could happen. It's probably unlikely that it happens in 2023, but you never know. The other thing is that businesses will continue to see new ownership in the next decade. Baby boomers, who are the lion's share of brick and mortar entrepreneurs, are looking to retire. 6 in 10 of these baby boomers are looking to sell their business in the next decade. And millennials are looking to take over. That is going to shift the way that these businesses change hands. It's going to be very different than it did when the baby boomers took over those businesses. And it's not like a normal financed purchase of a business anymore. It's just not in the cards for millennials to be able to do that, because they have student loan debt. They have a lot more debt than baby boomers did when they were looking to open these businesses, and the costs are much higher than what they were back then. So alternative financing methods are going to need to be considered, because a normal acquisition is not what's going to happen for brick and mortar businesses, and banks aren't going to be lending for that. They just don't lend for restaurants. So especially for a full acquisition, it's just way too risky for them. So current business owners need to figure out a better way of handing off these businesses where they still make the money that they invested in the business, but it's not going to be a huge sum buyout. The next consideration is open book financials with employees. It is something that is talked about in this industry more in the last couple of years than it ever has been before, because of the recession and COVID. And it is a trend that should be happening. Any other business that you have that you operate, you have conversations about the finances of the business with the employees. It's this weird thing with the restaurant industry where that never gets talked about. I don't know where it came about from, but for me, when I was working in the restaurant industry, nobody ever talked about the finances. I had no idea what the revenue numbers were. I had no idea what the profitability of the business was. I didn't have any idea of what the food cost was. That was something that only the chef, the general manager, and the partners of the business knew. That is not a useful way to run your business. And employees want to be involved in that process. For me, if I was in that position where I didn't know what the food cost was, and that we did need to improve food costs, I would have been more cognizant of that food cost. But not knowing that, like, what am I supposed to do? I don't know if it's good or not. So talking about your open book financials and opening your books and showing them what P&L and explaining to them what a profit and loss is, and explaining to them what cash flow is super helpful. It will help retain your employees. It will help prepare them to be better managers, and it will help them to be better future entrepreneurs. So key takeaways for today. One is that people rely on restaurants more than they ever have before. And so restaurants are not in such a precarious position when a recession is looming. Number two, inflation is slowing, but it is still a consideration for the year. They cut inflation in half for food cost for the increase of the price of food. However, it's still 3 times more than what it should be, and it's still going to be a consideration for 2023. Number three, look to diversify your income and find other more other revenue sources that are not reliant on sit-down business to make sure that you're protected against any future pandemics or anything of the like. Finally, make sure that you're doing takeout. If you have seen anything with Gen Z, they are definitely much more focused on takeout than they are on sit-down restaurants. And if you really want to make sure that you can boost revenue and also protect your revenue against COVID or any other pandemic, having takeout and having that system in place and strong and a large percentage of your revenue is going to make you well suited for any future issues. If you have any questions about what you heard about today, you can visit us on our website at prefix.accountants, or you can shoot us an email at hello@prefix.accountants. And you can see all the socials below. If you want to get in direct, you can DM me directly on Twitter as well. Thank you so much, and hopefully we'll talk to you soon.